Morena, good morning everyone. Thanks for that, Craig. Yes, my name's Nick Jones. I'm a Health and Safety Inspector based in Christchurch. As Craig said, I'm going to give you a bit of a brief overview of the asbestos regulations and talk to you a bit about what we're looking for as an inspectorate and what we're finding out on site. So the removal and management of asbestos continues to be one of the biggest issues out there at the moment, and we do need to get better about how we're managing it. So this morning I'm going to be using a couple of terms. PCBU, this of course is a person who's conducting a business or undertaking. ACM, which is asbestos containing material, and ACD, which is asbestos containing dust. So the asbestos regulations are modelled on the Australian regs. From April 4th, 2016, the asbestos regs became law. If you have asbestos in your workplace, or your work involves working with asbestos, then the asbestos regulations are relevant to you, so you need to know about them. So some of the key regulatory changes. Asbestos work is prohibited by default. The regulations make it very clear. You can't work with asbestos unless it's in accordance with the regulations. Asbestos comes in many forms, as you probably well know, but in terms of in regards of the new regulations, there are two key terms that anyone working with asbestos needs to become familiar with, and they are friable and non-friable. Friable asbestos is defined as in a powder form or able to be crumbled, pulverised or reduced to a powder by hand pressure when dry. It is the highest risk because its fibres are more readily released into the atmosphere where they can be breathed in. Non-friable simply means not friable and includes ACM in a bonded material. Now non-friable generally carries a lesser risk when working with it. So there's a couple examples there. And I'd like to say perhaps the Super 6 may not necessarily be a bonded material before we get any questions afterwards, but it's an example of a common bonded material and a common friable material. The new asbestos regulations are New Zealand's chance to change our approach to working with asbestos and to help keep more people safe. PCBUs need to think about their premises. If a building is pre-2000s, it means it's likely to contain asbestos, full stop. PCBUs need to determine if there is asbestos in their buildings, and a competent person must make this determination. If there is asbestos, its presence and location must be clearly indicated. From April 4th, 2018, PCBUs must have prepared an asbestos management plan for their workplace that contains asbestos, or the workplace where asbestos is likely to be present from time to time. The asbestos management plan must be kept up to date, reviewed, and made readily available to people like workers, PCBUs, and others. If there is refurbishment work or demolition work commencing, the asbestos needs to be removed prior to the demolition or refurbishment work starting. Communicating planned asbestos removal work to people that may be affected, such as home occupiers, neighbours, and other PCBUs, etc. The new regulations and information will help businesses manage asbestos risks. So with the new regulations come some changes to the licensing regime. Previously, the licence to remove asbestos was held by an individual, and it was a certificate of competency or a COC. Now the licence will be held by a PCBU, and the PCBU will employ or engage supervisors and workers who will actually do the physical work. So Class A licensed work involves the highest risk, as they will remove friable asbestos, non-friable asbestos, ACM and ACD. Class B licensed work involves non-friable asbestos, ACM and ACD. The actual removal work will involve a supervisor who will be overseeing the work, who must be present on site at all times for Class A work and be in the vicinity for Class B removal work, and that means available within 30 minutes. You'll see that for the removal of non-friable ACM of areas less than 10 square metres, that this work is unlicensed. However, it must be carried out in a safe manner by competent persons. Workers carrying out asbestos removal work, licensed or unlicensed, need to receive appropriate training and instruction. All licensed removalists must have the removal work supervised by a trained person. Currently, the supervisor can be the holder of a certificate of competency with the appropriate classification, or a person who has completed the WorkSafe Supervisor Competency Test. Licensed assessors are required for air monitoring and clearance inspections, and they must be independent to the removalist. This also provides a third-party assurance for the remover, the worker, and the client. The assessor must be a competent person, and if they're licensed by us, they'll meet this criteria. Training. WorkSafe has been working with Skills Organ NZQA to develop training for those supervising asbestos removal work and carrying out assessor work. The training is based on the Australian qualification and has been enhanced to reflect the New Zealand laws, and it's now available. So there's a transitional provision here, guys. Now, licence holders have until April 2018 to obtain the NZQA training for supervisors and assessors. So WorkSafe have a number of inspectors who are trained in assessing asbestos removal work, and an assessment visit would commence with a general discussion about how the work was being carried out with the supervisor. Inspectors will want to know who is doing the work, what class of removal work is being carried out, what licence is held, and what removal method has been employed. Inspectors will want to know who is doing the work. The requirements of the asbestos regulations are quite prescriptive, and many of the work practices and processes are described in the approved code of practice. The inspector would also check that the workers were trained to do the work and that workers are involved in safety discussions about how they're doing the work. Inspectors could also check if the work has been notified through to WorkSafe. The inspector may request documentation such as the asbestos removal and control plan, clearance certificates, air monitoring results, survey documents, analysis results, and any other documentation that they may think is appropriate. The inspector could also include a more detailed assessment on how the work is being carried out, and this would include checking the details of the asbestos removal and control plan, basically to ensure that the written documentation is actually being implemented out on site. The inspector could also check that the equipment being used was up to standard and maintained. Inspectors could also check that the removal work has been communicated to people in the vicinity that may be affected by the work. So think about neighbours, PCBUs, occupiers. Again, the ACOP has good information here. So inspectors visiting a demolition or refurbishment site will be looking for evidence that asbestos that is likely to be disturbed by the work has been identified and removed before the work starts, so far as reasonably practicable. Licensed persons have carried out the asbestos removal, so we'll be checking for that. We'll be looking for evidence that a clearance inspection has been conducted by an independent, competent person and a certificate of clearance has been obtained before reoccupation of the place. Asbestos that is not likely to be disturbed by a refurbishment job but has been identified in the workplace must be clearly indicated. We'll be looking for evidence that that is the case. So for this part of the presentation, I'd like to show you some common issues that inspectors do come across. An inspector visited this particular demolition site where some old vinyl floor, old lino, was still observed within the structure. So demolition work was ongoing. It hadn't been identified as a suspect ACM, so it hadn't been analysed for asbestos content. So the inspector issued a notice to stop the demolition work until all asbestos had been identified and removed from the structure. Further investigation and analysis revealed that the lino did in fact contain asbestos. But it's a good example of where there's been a failure to ensure that a competent person determined the presence of ACM in the building, and a failure to identify and remove the asbestos that was likely to be disturbed by the work. Inspector visited this particular residential building. It was undergoing refurbishment work and observed cement sheeting that had been stripped from the building, broken and spread about the site. The cement sheet also had not been identified as a suspect ACM, so it had not been sampled and analysed for asbestos content. The inspector issued a notice to stop the work. The material was analysed and it did in fact contain asbestos. So the workers involved had likely been exposed due to a lack of any asbestos controls during the work. Also, the entire surrounds were consequently contaminated with asbestos. Again, a failure to ensure that a competent person determined the presence of ACM at the workplace. and a failure to identify and remove asbestos that was likely to be disturbed by the refurbishment work before the work started. Here's a bit of an example of some unlicensed asbestos removal work. Again, lino floor covering. This particular floor was identified as ACM correctly through a survey, which is great. However, the PCBU engaged an unlicensed person to do the removal work. And as you can see by the photo on the right, they made a real mess of it. The site was left with asbestos-containing backing material spread right throughout the house. So sometimes what seems like a cost-saving measure to begin with can be a really costly mistake to make. So never take shortcuts with asbestos. It's simply not worth it. An inspector observed a residential building undergoing refurbishment work again. Super 6 roofing material had been broken up and spread about the site. So our inquiries revealed that the PCBU landlord had engaged a business to remove the Super 6 roof, which contained asbestos. However, the business that he engaged was not licensed to remove asbestos. So obviously the work was undertaken incorrectly and without adequate controls in place to manage the risk. And consequently, the site was contaminated with asbestos. So I guess the message we're trying to give here, if you're a tradesman on site and you identify a suspect material like Super 6 roofing, cement sheeting, lino floor covering, ask the question. It's your health, it's your mate's health, it's your friends, it's your family that you're taking contamination back to. Assure yourselves on site. Ask for the survey. Ask for the analysis results. So what are we doing to help you, WorkSafe? We've got a good website now, and we've got a list of licensed removers and assessors available there to help you, a list of laboratories, licensed landfills, and you can also download copies of the approved code of practice for the management and removal of asbestos. So this sets out WorkSafe New Zealand's expectations in relation to identifying, controlling work health and safety risks arising from asbestos. It's a great guideline. Conducting asbestos surveys good practice guideline is available there too. So this guideline is for PCBUs conducting asbestos surveys, workers carrying out surveys, and PCBUs that need to identify asbestos in the workplace. So if you have a workplace, there's potential for asbestos to be within the workplace, this document will be good for you too. We also have fact sheets which cover working with asbestos, what it means for people engaging asbestos workers, personal protective equipment to use when working with asbestos, health monitoring for asbestos workers, and safely removing asbestos. So some good resources there. So to close, we're here to help you, and there are resources available to help you do the work safely and correctly. Thank you. Kia ora. Good morning.